Ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by thanking, first of all, the Baltic Development Forum and Microsoft for organizing this conference on the topic of regional growth, and also, of course, to the City of Stockholm for hosting us all and taking this initiative. I'm honored to have been given this opportunity to contribute on the discussion on how the talent and skill shortages affect growth in this region, and ideas on how to best address this issue. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Ban Ki-moon, stated some time ago that, and I quote, "Migration can and should be a tool to help lift us out of this economic crisis. Human mobility makes our economies more efficient, even when they are not growing, and by making sure that the right skills can reach the right places at the right time." End of quote. We must regard increased mobility as something positive, both of the EU and countries of origin, even during an economic crisis. We all face the challenge posed by the current high rate of unemployment. At the same time, it is important to underline that this does not necessarily exclude labor shortages from occurring in some occupations and sectors. The challenge is matching the demands of employers and workers with particular skills. During 2012, the Swedish Migration Board issued 3,200 work permits to computing professionals. This is the biggest occupational group after seasonal workers, and the statistics show that even during times of economic distress, employers in Sweden still demand workforce from outside Sweden. Something that can have a negative impact on growth is if employers are not able to recruit people with the right skills. And growth is something which we need in order to fight unemployment. The necessity to be able to recruit skills is needed is something that is particularly true for small and medium-sized companies. The multinationals, they often have the option of outsourcing overseas. And therefore, facilitating increased opportunities for labor migration is of vital importance to meet both present and future challenges. The EU must remain competitive on the global labor market. Migration is as natural a component of our increasingly globalized societies and economies as increased flows of goods and capital. The scale and scope of international migration, as well as the complexity of migration issues, has grown substantially in recent years. The need to develop innovative ways to maximize the positive effects of migration for the benefit of all is therefore more important than ever, especially now in times of difficult economic circumstances and challenges throughout Europe. I hope that this forum will allow us to agree that it is only through a truly comprehensive and coherent approach towards migration, development, and integration issues that all stakeholders can benefit from migration in the long term. It is essential that we continue to develop the global approach to migration to strengthen the positive link between migration, development, and regional growth. It is my firm belief that even in times of economic crisis, it is crucial that we continue to manage migration in a way that is sustainable in the long term, and that we continue to deepen our cooperation on migration and development issues. We must make sure that our labor markets remain dynamic when we are confronted with the reality of demographic aging of our populations and shrinking workforce. Just as calls for increased protectionism are not the answer to our common economic challenges, I believe that efforts to stifle migration are both unwise and short-sighted. Possibly, we can compensate part of our declining labor force with increased productivity. However, we can neither maintain sustainable economic growth nor retain public welfare on an acceptable level without a constant inflow. Migration can be a valuable tool to strengthen demographically challenged regions that have jobs but a diminishing workforce. And a strategy for regional development that includes migration can re-energize regions, stimulate growth, and give rise to new investment opportunities. Now, with an eye to our future needs, political efforts to reduce barriers for mobility must continue, even in times of low demand for labor. Ladies and gentlemen, the need to create labor migration regimes that can handle the demand for both high and lesser skilled labor are of crucial importance. On the 15th of December 2008, the new rules for labor immigration to Sweden entered into force. Our reform is designed to create a demand-driven, effective and flexible system which will make it easier for people to come to Sweden to work, and also make it easier for Swedish companies to recruit labor from outside the EU. The reform is also designed in a way that workers of all skill levels can migrate to Sweden under a general framework. The main driving force for our reform is the recognition that there are labor shortages in Sweden that will not be filled by people living in Sweden or in other EU countries. Another driving force is the fact that our population is rapidly getting older, and that fewer and fewer people of working age will have to support an increasing percentage of the population in the future. And this might threaten economic growth and the sustainability of our welfare system in the long term. Of course, labor migration is only one of several instruments needed to prevent labor shortages. But it is certainly an important complement along with an optimal utilization of labor already residing in our country. The Swedish system is completely demand-driven. By this I mean that it is now the Swedish employers themselves and not the Swedish Public Employment Agency who decide whether or not they have a need to recruit someone from outside Sweden or the EU to fill a particular vacancy. Our demand-driven system stresses the employer's demand for labor, and there are no special caps or quotas to determine how many labor migrants that can enter the Swedish labor market. And past experiences have shown us that the labor market tests previously performed by Swedish government agencies have not always been optimal for realizing the changing needs of individual employers. A relatively small country like Sweden needs to stay competitive in the global competition for labor. One way of doing this is to offer a simple and transparent admission procedure for third country nationals whose skills are sought after on the labor market. Our new system recognizes that we need foreign workers of all skill levels and in many different branches and sectors, everything from engineering and communications technology to seasonal berry picking. In this new system, the same rules and conditions apply regardless of your position. Based on the goal of shorter processing times and a more efficient work permit process, the Swedish Migration Board, in the period of October 2011 to October 2012, launched a new program in which companies and employers became certified in labor market matters. And this certification entails that the company or employer accept the task of submitting a complete application to the Migration Board, which in turn commits to reaching a decision within a certain time frame. In October 2012, the Migration Board decided to introduce an extended and permanent certification system, and the vast majority of certified companies are IT related. And as of December 2012, more than 3,000 work permits have been issued to employees of over 400 certified companies. The average processing time is currently 5 days, in comparison to the goal of assessment and decision within 90 days, not 19, but 90 days in work permit matters where there is no certification. In 2011, the OECD published a review of the Swedish labor migration system. And it was very satisfying that the OECD confirmed that the Swedish system appears to be the most open and liberal among OECD countries, and also that it is relatively quick and inexpensive. I firmly believe that this system will help this region to continue to grow and companies to develop. An addition that is made to the work permit system in order to facilitate the recruiting of top talents is the possibilities for visiting students to apply for a residence and work permit while in Sweden. It is a key factor that benefits everyone if the students from outside the EU have a possibility of staying in Sweden after their studies and pursuing careers in their chosen field of study. One important lesson that we learned from our previous, more closed system for labor migration is that temporary labor programs can only work if the need for labor truly is only temporary. If employers' needs for labor often extend beyond the short term, as is the case in Sweden, then we must have a flexible system in places that allows for temporary migration to become more long-term or even permanent. Ladies and gentlemen, when we address issues regarding regional growth related to migration management, we must also be aware of the fact that migration patterns have changed significantly over the past decades. There is evidence that shows that the old paradigm of migration for permanent settlement is increasingly giving way to more temporary and circular migration. According to last year's International Migration Outlook, labor migration flows have decreased in many countries due to the economic crisis. And this is, of course, the immediate short-term effects in many countries. But as global mobility increases as a natural consequence of globalization and economic interdependence, the creation of flexible legislation for migrants' residence permits is all the more important in order to facilitate temporary and/or more permanent voluntary return to countries of origin. In our new system, we provide a route from temporary to permanent residence status for all labor immigrants after 4 years. And this means that after 4 years, with a temporary work permit, permanent residence permit can be granted. And I strongly believe that a key issue for continued growth is the availability of competence. And with our new work permit system, we give companies the possibilities, while recruiting from abroad, to an efficient work permit process in order to attract top talents. Of course, one cannot effectively address migration without addressing the issue of integration. The two are inseparably linked, and policies to address them should reinforce one another. Another major feature in our new legislation on labor immigration is that all migrants that are admitted to Sweden are given basically the same rights as Swedish citizens and are allowed to bring their family with them from day one. The spouses of labor migrants are also granted full access to the labor market. And this is a unique feature, very much so. And we consider it to be an important competitive factor in the competition for the skills and workforce, and should hopefully also be beneficial in terms of integration. From a Swedish perspective, a truly flexible and demand-driven system for labor migration, where employers themselves decide on whom to recruit, is the most effective way to fill labor shortages, both higher and lesser skilled, and to maintain a long-term sustainable migration policy. Our experience tells us that we, as the government or government agencies, might not be best suited to tell the employers what their labor needs are. Now, having said that, I still believe that it is the government's role to make sure that social dumping does not occur, and that it is also the government's role to put legislation in place that protects the employees' rights on the labour market and ensures that labour immigration is not used as a tool for unsound competition. Now, ladies and gentlemen, even if our motivations for this reform has focused mainly on Sweden's own needs and interests, the Swedish government is firmly committed to the notion that increased mobility is in itself positive and an important goal. In 2009, I appointed a parliamentary committee that was tasked with examining issues related to mobility and the positive effects of circular migration in Sweden and migrants' countries of origin. The committee analyzed migration patterns to and from Sweden, examined how different policy areas affect conditions for voluntary return and circular migration, and in 2012 the committee proposed possible changes to our national legislation, as well as other measures to improve these conditions. This is a natural and timely complement to our new legislation on labour migration to Sweden, and demonstrates very clearly the Swedish government's commitment to maximising the positive development potential of migration for all stakeholders. And my plan is to present a government bill to the Parliament in the not so distant future. It is my belief that increased mobility of migrants can make up a triple win situation: to promote development in the countries of origin, serve the labour market needs of countries of destination, and benefit migrants themselves insofar as they acquire new contacts, knowledge and skills while abroad. As we continue our efforts to maximise the positive development effects for migration, for countries of origin, and for the migrants themselves, we must keep in mind that migrants can and do often act as agents of development when they are able to move more freely between their countries of origin and destination. Finally, the Swedish labour migration reform has been in place for 4 years. It has not resulted in a large inflow of labour migrants to Sweden, despite the open nature of the system. The relatively low inflow can, in part, be due to the fact that the reform entered into force during a global financial crisis. Time will tell how successful our reform will be. It is, however, my strong belief that managing high and lesser skilled migration through a general framework has a lot of benefits for all. It is clear that migration management is a policy area in which we have a lot to learn from each other. A compilation of best practices from all OECD countries could provide a significant contribution to better manage a more comprehensive labour migration policy for the benefit of all. The Swedish labour migration reform aims to ease the administrative burden that companies face when recruiting talents from abroad, and I am convinced that this will help us creating more jobs and create growth. Thank you very much for your attention.